college and career Sunday school class teacher at First Baptist in Hallsville, but I have a lot of friends and that watch our lessons, and so welcome. Hope that we have a good crowd today. And if you will, turn to the book of Jeremiah, chapter 13. I'm going to read 11 verses for us today, and then we'll talk about that a little bit. Jeremiah chapter 13 and verse number 1 says, Thus saith the Lord unto me, Go and get thee a linen girdle, and put it on thy loins, and put it not in water. So I got a girdle according to the word of the Lord, and I put it on my loins. And the word of the Lord came unto me the second time, saying, Take the girdle that thou hast got, which is upon thy loins, and arise, and go to Euphrates, and hide it there in a hole of the rock. So I went, I hid it by Euphrates, as the Lord commanded me. And it came to pass after many days that the Lord said unto me, Arise, go to Euphrates, and take the girdle from thence, which I commanded thee to hide there. And so I went to Euphrates and digged and took the girdle from the place where I had hid it. And behold, the girdle was marred. It was profitable for nothing. Then the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Thus saith the Lord, After this manner will I mar the pride of Judah and the great pride of Jerusalem, this evil people, which refuse to hear my words, which walk in the imagination of their heart, walk after other gods to serve them and to worship them, shall even be as this girdle which is good for nothing. For as the girdle cleaveth to the loins of a man, so have I caused to cleave unto me the whole house of Israel and the whole house of Judah, saith the Lord, that they might be unto me for a people and for a name and for a praise and for a glory, but they would not hear. This is an unusual story. Of course, the Bible has a lot of unusual stories in it. And the title that I'm going to give this lesson is The Good for Nothing Girdle. One thing I want to point out is that as you read these Old Testament stories, most of the time, if not all the time, they are for the nation of Israel. And the nation of Israel was is God's chosen people. They are his children by birth. And by birth, I mean natural birth. Now, if you're a Christian, a child of God, and you're not a Jew, or even if you are a Jew, if you're a child of God and you are not just born physically into his family, but you've been born again into his spiritual family, then you are his people. And so the stories have an application for all of us because we're his children. Just want to make that point that a lot of times I just read one of these stories or tell the story and then go on to apply it to us as Christians, even though we're not part of Israel. But it's a good illustration because we are God's children if we've accepted Christ as our Savior. So anyway, here's the lesson. First of all, I'm going to just, in my own words, retell the story briefly as I go through here. God told Jeremiah the prophet to take a linen girdle and put this girdle around his loins, it says. Now, as I think back, my first exposure to the term girdle, as far as I can remember, was that my grandmother had a girdle. Now, I've never spoken, I don't think, much on this to this class about my grandmother, but I miss my grandmother every day. She died in 1980, and my grandmother, of course I had two grandmothers, but the one I'm speaking of I called Mimi, and she was a great Christian, the greatest Christian I assume I've ever known. When she prayed, she talked to the Lord in a conversational way, and you could tell that she had a very real relationship with the Lord. And great testimony. Her life was a great testimony for Christ. She was kind of a heavy woman, and she was kind of short, but I remember that she had a girdle. And I didn't think much about it in those days. It seemed kind of like an odd garment to me. It's something I certainly was not going to wear. And she's the only person I knew of that actually wore one. Well, if you've never seen one of those old-fashioned girdles, they essentially are just something to hold your midsection in a better shape and support your body, your midsection. Well, we still have, and I don't even know if they still have those type girdles as a cloth, something you can still buy. I'm sure that they do, of some sort. And I remember later seeing some old movies. And in old movies, you'll see what they called a corset used. And I have an old, what's the word I'm looking for? See if I can see it on my shelf here. Yes. This right here is a 1902, it's a copy of a 1902 Sears and Roebuck catalog. And if you go through here, there's a bunch of corsets and girdles for sale in there. I just thought of that. But anyway, I assume most all of us are familiar with either that term or a term similar. And I've seen in more recent times people use different types of body shaping clothing, like what do you call that stuff? Spandex, or some type of girdle that causes you to look more fit and trim than you actually are. But all of these garments that we're speaking of have one thing in common, and that is that they fit very tightly and close to your skin, to your body. That was really the point here of this, is God told Jeremiah to get a girdle and put it on, and he said, don't put it in water. And it doesn't really say how long he wore it, but after he wore it for some period of time, God told him to take it off and go down to the river Euphrates specifically, and to find a place to bury it, and he buried it. And then later, the Lord said, now go get the girdle. And when he says in verse number 7, and when he digged and took the girdle from the place where he hid it, behold, the girdle was marred and was profitable for nothing. So the girdle was ruined, which is something you would expect. And then he makes an illustration. He says, this people, my people, are like this girdle. They're supposed to be close to me, but they've allowed themselves to get to a place where they're useless. And so in verse 11, in fact, he says, as the girdle cleaveth to the loins of a man, so have I caused to cleave to me the whole house of Israel and the whole house of Judah, saith the Lord, that they might be unto me for a people and for a name and for a praise and for a glory, but they would not. So I'm going to go through a few lessons here about these verses, and I want to speak by the Lord's help as frankly and as straightforwardly as I can to myself. And let's examine this together, and let's take to heart what God's saying here and what he wants us to hear from this. First of all, I want to point out that we are to be close to God as a girdle is to the body. So the first thing that we need, the first lesson here, and that God brings out, is that he wants us to be that close to him as a girdle is to your body. In other words, clinging and tight to him. And several things I think of. One is that a girdle covers in an area that's some of the most vital parts of our body, from the heart and innards down to the loin area. These are areas that we feel defensive, very protective of, and we keep them mostly covered up and protected, and we feel vulnerable if they're too much exposed. And so a girdle is, as an illustrative garment for the purpose of this lesson, is that we're supposed to stay close to God. Now, it's been my experience that I've spent much of my life not being that close to the Lord. And it's our obligation to. It's the place to be. It's the place of blessing. God created us, and He made us for a purpose, and we will never find true peace, happiness, fulfillment until we find that place that God made us to be. And that can only be found if we find ourselves clinging to Him and close to Him. And the next lesson is that we are to keep our garments clean. Now, this is something that most of us kind of take for granted, is that we should wear clean clothes. But I've known some people that didn't wear clean clothes. And matter of fact, one of the things that I think about when I watch some of these old movies is what people must have smelled like after they'd been on a cattle drive and hadn't changed their clothes in weeks or months and sweated through them on a daily basis. Or people who did not have access to, at any time when you have to be out in the wild, or people who just don't take time to bother to bathe. I knew a young lady one time, and she went to the doctor because she was having stomach aches. This is a true story. And it turns out that she was 6 months pregnant, this young woman was. And the doctor said, look, you've got to take a bath. And she said, she smelled. And she said, oh, I can't do that. My grandmother said that if I took a bath while I was pregnant, I would die. Well, I've never heard that before, but that's evidently it was some old wives' tale, as they say, or some superstition or something that they had. But he said she was like 6 months along. Now, I don't know how long she had known that she was pregnant, but it had obviously been a pretty long time since she had bathed. And so I'm saying all that just to say that garments essentially are useless when they get filthy. But, and by the way, my mother, when I was growing up, if I tried to wear something twice that I'd sweated in especially, and she could tell, she just wouldn't have it. And of course, I did not do my own laundry when I was very young. But, and some parents do have their children do their laundry, which is a good idea to teach them as early and young as possible. And, but as a general rule, I've been brought up in a family and around people that are very conscientious about their clothes being clean. And probably the vast majority of you, if not all of you, know exactly what I'm speaking of, and that you're the same way. Well, and of course, my wife is a cleanophobic. I mean, she can find dirt where you think you're in a clean room until she thinks that it's, she can find dust where no one else seems to be able to. And so, anyway, that's really kind of just beside the point. But we are supposed to stay clean. In the illustration here, we are the girdle in this illustration. God's children are supposed to cling to the Lord, and we are supposed to keep ourselves clean. And it's vitally important. This morning I went to church, and we had youth service at our church this morning. And the young lady that spoke talked about this very issue. I was very proud of her for bringing this out, because being bold about being clean and about taking a stand for cleanliness. And by this, I mean spiritual cleanliness. And she specifically spoke of watching things on television or in a movie that would cause you to think things that you shouldn't think, or to be exposed to things that would violate your purity and not make you think the way you should think. And she specifically mentioned pornography and how it's a violation of your soul and of your sense of cleanliness. And I marveled at her boldness about being clean. And it's not a popular message in our day and age. People want to think that whatever they do is fine. But anyway, the illustration here is that we could go to a long list of things that are unclean. But as a general rule, God will speak to your heart about what is clean and what's not. And it's important that we stay clean. The next lesson is this, is that filth can go beyond making a garment unuseful in that it's just dirty. in time and in extreme situations, it will make it completely unuseful. And so what God told the prophet to do was go down and bury the garment in the river sand, down beside the river, and then he went back later and dug it up. And when he did, it was spoiled. It was useless. It was no longer fit to be used. And what God's saying is, if you don't keep yourself clean, then I'm not useful. You may want to serve the Lord, but you're not going to be useful for the Lord if you're not willing to keep yourself clean. Something else that the young lady that spoke this morning mentioned was our speech. You might think that a word that you're using there's nothing wrong with it, it's just a word. But if it damages your testimony and makes it difficult for people to appreciate your faith, then it's dirtying you. It's ruining your usefulness for Christ. And so we need to make sure that we stay clean before the Lord. So clean, well-kept garments are very important. And that's the point he's making here. And lastly, filthy garments are useless. Thank you for coming and listening today, and I pray you'll pray for all of us, our classes. We're beginning to meet at church again, but we haven't had our Sunday school class. But also, I hope that you will take the time to distribute our lessons. I put these also on YouTube, and so if you will, maybe share that YouTube video. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.